when you go through the UK aviation policy white paper and you count the number, the times the word connectivity is mentioned, I counted it, you see that word connectivity on average every 4 pages. When you go through the Dutch aviation strategy, called the Luchtvaartnota, you will see the word connectivity, or the Dutch equivalent, network quality, mentioned on average every 2 pages. And when you go through the European aviation strategy, you will also see that connectivity is a major issue there. And I think that nowadays in policy circles, among governments, connectivity is really a buzzword. There's an increasing understanding that growth in connectivity brings economic benefits, and that a good connectivity performance is considered to be key to the competitiveness of cities, regions, and countries. You see that reflected in aviation strategies. You see it reflected in many consultancy studies. You see it reflected in really a flurry of research on connectivity models. So connectivity is a buzzword. And why do governments care about connectivity? Well, growth in connectivity, if we think about connectivity, more direct destinations, shorter travel times, higher frequencies, that brings benefits to consumers and businesses. Shorter travel times, maybe lower fares, and these benefits ripple through the rest of the economy. And there's of course the argument of jobs, there's the argument of GDP. But governments, and this is in particular relevant to today, may want to optimize connectivity outcomes when capacity is scarce. So what is the connectivity that best meets society's needs when you don't have enough of it? There might be social objectives related to connectivity outcomes. You may want to be connected to peripheral regions, for example, and impose so-called public service obligations or essential air service programs. So these, I think, three very important arguments for governments to have the objective to enhance or influence connectivity outcomes. Not talking about the economic rationale, but motives for governments to influence those connectivity outcomes. So many governments formulate policies to enhance connectivity outcomes, and that seems in particular an issue when airport capacity is scarce. So the question is, what can governments do to influence those connectivity outcomes? What can they do? What is their toolbox? What can they potentially do to stimulate connectivity or to enhance connectivity? And then we first need to know what is connectivity? How do we measure it? What drives connectivity? And then what is the toolbox to influence connectivity? And as James said this morning already, there's also the question, to what extent do you want to intervene as government in the market, or create the conditions to let the market do its work? And I think that's also a very important question related to connectivity outcomes. What is connectivity? How to measure it? Well, very simple definition. Connectivity, air connectivity, the extent to which nodes in a network are connected to each other, or the extent to which airports are connected to each other, or the extent to which regions are connected to each other. And when you think about what defines good connectivity at an airport, well, you will think about many direct destinations, high frequencies, the availability of indirect travel options from small communities to reach the rest of the world with a transfer at an intermediate hub airport, maybe short transfer times, maybe low prices as well. So we already see that it's a kind of multidimensional concept. And in general, I think we can distinguish between 3 or 4 types of connectivity. The direct connectivity, mostly preferred by the passengers, going from here to there without a transfer, non-stop, or maybe a multi-stop flight. Then there is the indirect connectivity, which is a connection that I took from Amsterdam here to Querétaro, transferring at Mexico City. So the indirect connection, and that direct connectivity and the indirect connectivity is what is important for the local consumer. That is the accessibility for me to the rest of the world, the accessibility for companies to the rest of the world, the direct and the indirect connectivity. And a special form of that is onward connectivity. But the real third form of connectivity you can call hub connectivity, which is the number of connections with a transfer at a certain hub airport. How many connections are there possible via Mexico City within a single week, for example? And that provides you with an indication of the strength of the hub in the connecting market, which is a bit instrumental to your direct and indirect connectivity, because it allows you to generate transfer traffic, which allows you to fill the empty seats on a flight, which allows you to have more connectivity than would be possible based on the local demand alone. Direct, indirect connectivity in the literature also known as accessibility, sometimes airport connectivity, and hub connectivity also centrality. So you see multiple terms to describe that. Well, how do we measure it? Well, there are many models, many models. I think we can at least distinguish between what I call physical connectivity models and more like utility-based or generalized travel cost models. Physical connectivity models are, in essence, nothing more than just counting connections. How many times can we get from Amsterdam to Mexico City directly? How many times can we get per week indirectly from Amsterdam to Querétaro? And there are a lot of models. I reviewed them together with Renato Redondi from Bergamo in a paper in Transport Economics and Policy. Many models. And some of these models attach weight to the quality of the connection. Because I didn't like that 4-hour transfer time at Mexico City. I would rather have the direct flight. There was no direct flight. So, but those indirect connections have a lower quality than direct connections. Some models attach a kind of a quality to those connections. Indirect connections are built from flight schedules. Direct connections are directly available from flight schedules. And to build those connections, you use certain criteria on minimum connecting times and maximum detour times. What you define as an online connection. A KLM connection is an online connection, but KLM Lufthansa is not. So all kinds of restrictions that you have to build in such connectivity models. And the physical connectivity model is nothing more really than counting connections. How many connections are available from here to there, or how much travel time do I need to reach all destinations in the world? You get into the shortest and quickest path models. And they're fairly simple. They're quite, is our experience, fairly easy to explain to policymakers. And they're useful. Useful for consistent benchmarking of airports over time. For benchmarking an airport against its competitors. Quite useful. And you get then these kind of figures. I took one for Latin America. These are the top airports in Latin America according to their direct and indirect connectivity. And congratulations, Sao Paulo.
That's why I came.
I'm sorry that Querétaro is not on the screen, sorry. And Mexico City has the second best. And below you see the development of hub connectivity for a number of European airports over time. And that makes me happy that we see that Amsterdam has been growing steadily over the years. And in terms of hub connectivity, after Frankfurt, the second best airport in terms of hub connectivity. So that's the type of results that you get. However, these connectivity counting models do not always reflect passenger behavior. Some try to do, but they don't include some very important variables in passenger behavior, like price, like values of time of various passenger segments. And then you need to go to generalized travel cost models, utility-based models, in which you try to measure all the inconveniences the passenger faces traveling from here to there. Your access time, your in-flight time, your transfer time, your ticket price, and translate all those variables in monetary terms. You can use that for passenger choice modeling. You can use it maybe even to compare the welfare contribution of individual connections. And you can use it for welfare analysis. But our experience is that these kind of connectivity models are much more difficult to explain to policymakers, to the general audience. But they better reflect, certainly better reflect passenger behavior. All right. If we want to influence connectivity outcomes, we need to know what drives connectivity outcomes. And airlines serve those markets. They offer connections where there is demand. So at an airport level, for the level of connectivity, the size and the strength of the local origin destination market is a really important variable. How many people live around the airport? What is their GDP per capita that drives propensity to fly? The structure of the economy, availability of high-tech industries and service industries, tourism attractiveness, and of course your accessibility of the airport. The bigger that accessibility, the better that accessibility, the larger the catchment area that you can serve within a certain travel time. So we discussed that, I think, this morning. The ICE for Frankfurt significantly expanded the catchment area of the airport. So I think this is a very, very important driver. Now, at hub airports, we say that those hub airports, where there's a significant airline hub operation, they benefit from what we like to call a connectivity premium. So those hub airports, they're able to offer a larger number of destinations and frequencies, in particular when you look at long haul, and that would be possible based on local demand alone. And that's, of course, as Nicole pointed out earlier, because those hub airlines, they combine local and transfer traffic to serve markets that otherwise would be too thin to serve directly in a profitable way. So you basically fill the empty seats with transfer passengers, and as Mike Levine, one of the former executives of Northwest Airlines, like to call it, hubs are factories to create route density. And we did a very simple analysis for European airports. You see all the European airports plotted, and on the horizontal axis, the GDP within a 100-kilometer radius around each airport, and on the vertical axis, the number of long-haul destinations at each airport. And in red, we see the airport with a clear airline hub operation, and the blue dots are what we call the large origin destination airports. And what appears from such a figure is that given the local market at hubs, there's a larger number of local long-haul destinations than at the non-hub airports. So hub airports are able to offer a much larger number of long-haul destinations to the consumer than would be possible based on local demand alone. Hubs connectivity premium. And of course, there are other variables. It's not really a driver, but more a conditio sine qua non. You need to have your airport capacity and your airspace capacity to develop connectivity. And there, the airport visit cost that we discussed earlier, your airport charges, taxes, noise levies, ATC charges, cost for ground handling, for example, that determine the cost for the airline to operate for the airport and at the airport, and are a variable that influences their behavior, yes or no, to open a certain route to serve the airport. So airport visit costs are important in that sense. We have airport service levels and quality. We have market access. Also, an essential condition to develop connectivity are the traffic rights in place. Are there any restrictions on airport use? Night bans, for example, airport opening hours. Runway length is a variable that determines if you can have long-haul flights at all at your airport. So market access is also something that determines or influences connectivity at the airport level. So we have defined connectivity. We have seen that it's important for governments, mainly because of those positive externalities, the economic impact of connectivity growth. We've seen that many models to define, to measure connectivity. There's no one single best model, by the way. And we have briefly looked at the main determinants of connectivity. And now the question is, knowing this all, how can governments potentially influence connectivity outcomes? And in the paper, I've tried to summarize those tools that governments can potentially use. And maybe in the discussion we come up with more of them, or maybe we have to take some of them off the list. But when we start with the driver size and strength of the local market, then one important tool is, of course, investments in landside accessibility that will increase the catchment area of the airport, but also removing barriers to entry. When you liberalize the market, will mean more competition, fares will be going down, in particular if local carriers are entering the market, and lower fares mean market generation. More demand, more connections. Airport and then we have airport capacity, airspace capacity. As a government, you can make sure that there is timely availability of airport capacity through planning permissions, through trying to using kind of operational optimizations to use existing airport capacity more efficiently, but also doing that for the long term. So making sure that the airport does not get locked in terms of its development over time. Regulate restrictions on the use of the infrastructure is also one of the tools that government could use, like night bans, noise quota, the type of infrastructure that is there. Already mentioned runway length, but also the type of gate positions at an airport might influence your connectivity outcomes and is potentially within the reach of governments. And of course, in particular, investments in airport infrastructure should be subject to careful social cost-benefit analysis and probably also business cases regarding the airport itself. Then there's the driver of the airport visit costs, and I think that is clearly an area where governments have quite some influence through the regulation of airport charges, but also some of the visit costs are under direct government responsibility. Think of security fees or noise levies or government taxes in the UK, in Germany, in Norway, potentially Sweden quite quickly, and here in Latin America there are also quite some government taxes in place. And so this is really an area where there is room for governments to influence those connectivity outcomes. We earlier discussed the issue of peak pricing that potentially can achieve a more equal distribution of flights during the day. And there is the instrument of startup aid and incentives. In today's competitive aviation markets, airlines simply cannot stand operating a loss-making route during a long period of time. And startup aids and incentive packages by airports can be an important variable to make the airline decide to start a new route at the airport. And this is, of course, something that is mainly on the responsibility of the airport operator itself. But we see also government initiatives in this area. Look, for example, at the UK Regional Air Connectivity Fund, where there's a fund available to help airlines starting up new routes. The airline, together with the airport and local stakeholders, have to bid for funding, which is essentially a rebate on airport charges, if I'm correct. And it helps airlines to start new routes, and this is clearly something that is in the reach of governments. A coordinated tariff strategy within the multi-airport system can also be one of the instruments for governments to influence connectivity outcomes. In the Netherlands, for example, Geert already mentioned it this morning. The objective is to move leisure traffic and some of the low-cost traffic from the big airport in Amsterdam to the newly opened airport in Lelystad, Amsterdam North. And one of the ways to do so is a coordinated strategy by the airport operator. So lower charges at that new airport, higher charges at Amsterdam Airport, dedicated facilities for point-to-point airlines at Lelystad Airport to seduce airlines to use that other airport. So a coordinated strategy within a multi-airport system. Airport service levels and quality can be influenced by governments, for example, via the regulatory framework, when the service levels are part of that regulatory framework. And of course, some of the airport services are even in the hands of governments. Think of border control, in some countries security as well, where there is direct government influence on those airport service levels. And finally, we have the broad area of market access. Connections can only be formed when airlines have access to those markets, so air transport liberalization and negotiation of traffic rights is an important instrument for governments to make sure that the market access is there. And again, looking, for example, at KLM, at Amsterdam Airport, the Dutch government played a very important role there in the 1990s. It was the first one to negotiate an open skies agreement with the United States. Was antitrust immunity between Northwest Airlines and KLM, and it gave KLM a first mover advantage on the transatlantic. As the first European airlines, it got access to the whole US market. It gave it a first mover advantage, which I think is still at the basis of the connectivity that we see at Amsterdam Airport today. Negotiation of traffic rights and air transport liberalization. There may be the objective to connect the capital to peripheral regions, but not always is demand enough to make it attractive for airlines to serve routes to peripheral regions. And in Europe, at least, there is in Regulation 2008, if I'm correct, the possibility for governments to impose public service obligations, which is essentially a tendering process for airlines to get the unique right to operate a route during a certain period of time and yes or no get financial compensation for the losses they make on that route. And there's quite some discretionary power for the member states to impose those public service obligations. You need to mention it to the European Commission, but there's no formal agreement needed from the European Commission. And there are quite some public service obligations throughout Europe. And for some of them, you can question if those routes would not survive on the normal competitive circumstances, but most of them are, for example, northern Norway to connect those peripheral areas there. Connectivity assurances are another way that government may try to influence connectivity outcomes. After the Air France-KLM merger, the Dutch government was very much worried that part of the intercontinental network would move to Paris-Charles de Gaulle. It was the bigger hub with the bigger market, and the Dutch state agreed with Air France-KLM upon the so-called state assurances Air France-KLM. And those state assurances, in that state assurances, Air France-KLM agreed about continuing to operate a double hub system in Amsterdam and Paris-Charles de Gaulle during a certain period of time. And there was a list of 42 intercontinental key destinations, which back then we were invited to monitor. And the airline had to continue to operate those 42 key destinations during a period of 5 years. Beirut, Amman and Damascus were on that list, but at one point in time the carrier stopped serving those routes. But there was an escape route in the state assurances that if there were economic downturns and the routes were structurally unprofitable, the airline had the right to drop those routes. So in essence, it was more a paper tiger than it was really effective in influencing those connectivity outcomes. Imposition of traffic distribution rules, another way to influence connectivity outcomes, in particular when airport capacity is scarce. Within the European regulation, governments can impose traffic distribution rules to distribute traffic and connectivity between airports serving the same metropolitan area. And I think that in other areas of the world we see same initiatives. In Korea, between Gimpo and Incheon Airport, Haneda and Narita, traffic distribution rules to distribute traffic between different airports in the same system using certain criteria that in Europe must be non-discriminatory and neutral and not discriminate to the identity or the nationality of the airline. And you may facilitate a more efficient use of scarce capacity by facilitating secondary slot trading. In Europe, it's allowed to swap slots with monetary compensation. And as a government, you may want to try to make the process of secondary slot trading more smooth and transparent, for example, by setting up a slot portal, as ACL did in the UK. All right. In particular, when airport capacity is scarce, we see that it is tempting for governments to use a more administrative or regulatory approach to achieve certain desired connectivity outcomes. It gives a certain certainty or feeling of certainty about the outcomes. I think it's also easy to communicate, and you can think of traffic distribution rules, which are in place in Milan, and which are currently under consideration for the Netherlands as well. So when capacity is scarce, you may want to have the objective to use your primary congested airport for certain types of traffic and use your secondary airport for other types of traffic, and use traffic distribution rules to achieve that. A coordinated tariff strategy of the airport operator, public service obligations, bilateral air service agreements, or developing certain infrastructure or restrictions on infrastructure use to achieve certain connectivity outcomes. And it's quite tempting for governments to influence connectivity outcomes in that way. But I think, and that's one of my main messages here, that policymakers should be conservative in applying those administrative measures to influencing connectivity outcomes. Those administrative instruments are focused on the status quo, and we all know that the airline industry itself is very, very dynamic. So any measures that you design are focused on today and not on the future, which will definitely be different. And the risk is that governments and the policies lag behind the market, and the policy does not result in the desired changes, and many times has undesired consequences and side effects, which we discussed today as well. Governments also have incomplete information and knowledge about the connectivity that is best for society. In the Netherlands, the government has set up a list of types of connectivity that are considered more and less important for Dutch society. Guess which connectivity is on top? Well, sorry? Direct connectivity, and by whom is that connectivity generated? Exactly. So it's about connectivity of the hub carrier, long-haul connectivity, short-haul connectivity to business destinations, and then we have the connectivity to leisure destinations. But is that really the connectivity that generates most value for society? And that is the question you must ask. So, and it's very difficult for governments, I think, to determine that. And then we have history. And I think that history has shown that many of those interventions to influence connectivity, they have been tried, and the results have not always been that positive. In particular, with respect to traffic distribution rules. They have been applied in Milan, when the new Milan Malpensa airport was opened, to urge and make sure that airlines would use the new airport of Milan Malpensa and not the old city airport of Linate. And what we saw in practice was that airlines started to search for loopholes in the system, playing with the airline codes such that they had enough traffic on a certain destination to meet the criteria defined in the traffic distribution rules. And it also resulted in the fact that business passengers traveling for the city center of Milan that wanted to go to an intercontinental destination used Milan, transferred at a European hub airport, and went to their intercontinental destination instead of going to Milan Malpensa and taking their direct flight to their final destination. And according to research of Redondi, this effect even helped or contributed to the dehubbing of Milan Malpensa by Alitalia. And we see that there have been many court cases on those traffic distribution rules, because it's very difficult to design traffic distribution rules that are on the one hand effective and on the other hand non-discriminatory towards the nationality or the identity of the airline. De jure, but also de facto. But instruments such as public service obligations may be warranted to achieve certain social or political objectives, such as the accessibility of peripheral regions. Instead, I think that a market-based approach might be more appropriate as far as possible. So that means a timely realization of airport capacity to meet future demand, subject to careful evaluation of benefits and costs. Remove barriers to entry, ensure market access, and intervene there where the market fails. And when airport capacity is scarce, ensure that that capacity is used by those airlines that attach the highest value to the capacity. Not by steering the connectivity, not by steering the airlines, but, for example, by facilitating secondary slot trading, and provide alternatives to airlines that sell their slots in the market so that they have alternatives in the market. And maybe it's even time to think about facilitating primary trading at the most congested coordinated airports, given the growing scarcity of airport capacity worldwide in the coming decades. So my takeaways for today. There's an increased focus in policy circles on connectivity, mostly because of its perceived economic value. There are various instruments available for governments to influence connectivity outcomes, potentially. And I argue that policymakers should be modest about using administrative measures to influence connectivity outcomes, and instead search for ways to let the market do its work, because that is what is likely to generate the most efficient outcome. Thanks for connecting with me, and looking forward to the discussion.